Um, we have a crowded uh, uh, lineup of panelists tonight, including a special guest from the AU's Career Center. So I'm not going to take up a whole lot of time with lengthy introductions. I'll leave it to our speakers to introduce themselves. But first, we're very lucky to have our esteemed chair here tonight, Dr. Eric Lohr, to open the proceedings. So I'll turn it over to him, and then we'll get started.
Hello, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm so glad you chose to major or minor in history. And you probably know that history majors over the course of their careers, on average, make more than business majors and more than a whole slew of other professional majors. So you've made a good choice, not only for making your life richer and more interesting, but also a good professional choice as well. People who do well after history don't necessarily do this because they majored in history and to directly, apply the lessons that they learned in history or historical studies to their careers. They do it because they knew that their degree has little to do with their career, and they'll have to out hustle everyone else to make it. And you are people like all of us who had the chutzpah to sort of trust yourselves to do what you liked and found challenging as undergrads. That is a kind of pre-selected type of person who will succeed in everything. And I can't resist but bring in a couple of personal anecdotes here. First, my wife and my family, our families are entirely populated by educators and priests, and our son had absolutely no familiar role model for making money. So I spent 18 years with my son trying to convince him there's nothing wrong with money, and taught him about finance and et cetera. And it was all going fine. He was an economics major at Colgate. And until this Christmas, when he gave me the exact same sentence that I gave my father once. Turns out I have more history classes than econ classes, so I'm switching majors. So I said, okay, fine. But, he'll be fine. And he's probably going to make more money than his bored friends in econ classes. So you've done well, and you're going to do well. The second thing is, when I was an undergrad and when I was also a PhD student, I was super aggressive in looking for opportunities. High school teaching, law school, Peace Corps, internships in politics, everything. Even when I was a PhD student at Harvard, I kept exploring options and networking alternatives. Even the CIA, don't tell anyone. It's not easier at first for history majors, but in time, history majors outperform many others in all kinds of fields. And by the way, that's actually very much true of philosophy majors as well. So go for that if that's a desire of yours. Anyway, just a few thoughts to get this thing going. I think you're all going to do great in your careers, whatever they may be. And let's get on to our really amazing panel. I hope to see you in person in the fall.
Thank you so much, Eric. Our first group of panelists tonight were all once history undergraduates themselves, some of them at this very university. They have now all gone on to successful professional careers, which they will undoubtedly speak about. And so I'll go in the alphabetical order that we have here. So if we can begin with Justin Brubelo, we'll have all the panelists speak first, and then we'll open things up to questions from the audience. So please, Justin, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I was just telling Professor Shelford before everyone came in that I was in this spot maybe 12 years ago, but in Battelle Atrium with pizza afterwards, so it was a little bit better. Yeah, I'm an undergraduate graduate of AU in 2009. From there, I went on to teach in DC for 4 years before going back to graduate school at George Mason University, where I'm now working on my PhD, writing my dissertation. And in the meantime, I'm also working as a historian for History Associates in Rockville, Maryland. And History Associates is a historical consulting company. So we basically do history for hire, and it can be a very diverse set of projects that I can be working on at any particular time. So from one day I can be working on sort of like a site history of like a corporate site or a factory, environmental history. And the next day I'm working on whether or not Kyle, Texas is the fajita capital of the world. So, you know, it's a very diverse set of things that I work on, which is kind of a credit to my education, both at AU and at George Mason, that, you know, we learn not only kind of the what of history, but we also learn the how of history. You know, historians are often thought of as people who just kind of compile a bunch of facts and then spit those facts back out. But really, history is a way of thinking. It's, you know, how we approach evidence. It's how we approach, you know, literature, and how we kind of put those things together to make argument. So, you know, we need to not only think about what we're learning, but how we're learning how to do it as well. So I was asked to kind of prepare some, you know, advice or thoughts on careers going forward, and I think I have three. So the first is kind of going back to what I was just saying about the how of history. I would get used to talking to people who don't know what historians do, and talking about what it is that you can do as a historian, what you've learned to do. So like I said, you know, most people think about historians being people who just learn a bunch of facts and, you know all the battles to the Civil War or something. So, you know, what are you good at? What kind of skills have you learned? Well, you've learned to evaluate evidence. You know whether we can take something at kind of at face value, whether we should interrogate it a little bit further. We can put it in conversation with other evidence. And make arguments. You can synthesize. We, you know, as history majors, we read a lot. And what we have to do is we have to take the one book we read here and the other book we read here and kind of put it together and form our kind of theory on what actually happened. So you can read large volumes of information and synthesize them. What you can do is you can find the information that you're looking for. You know, hopefully as historians, we kind of have a research question and we know somewhat where to find it. So if there's a question to be answered, you know how to approach answering that question. So like I said, you know, get very good at talking about those skills to prospective employers to let them know that as a historian, you're not just somebody who knows a lot about some, you know, minutia. The second thing is, I would say, you know, from my experience in consulting is, you know, learn as much as you can about history. You know, we all have our likes and our specializations, but try to be as much of a generalist as possible. Be curious about different areas of history. And so you are kind of forced to do that as part of your requirements for the major, thankfully. But, you know, if in your electives, you know, if you can kind of spread it out as much as you can, I would encourage you to do that. And then the third thing is, this is going to become precariously close to learn to code. But if you can, learn to do something digital, or at least something that would set you apart from anybody else interviewing for the same position. So at History Associates, there were lots of people who applied for the position, but I was told one thing that set me apart is that I know digital history as well. So at George Mason University, it's a big digital history program. I've worked at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History in New Media, and I learned how to do some coding, working on CMSs, Omeka, Drupal, things like that. So I would learn a skill, particularly digital. I know Trevor Owens teaches in the spring there, teaches a digital history class. See if you can get in and learn something like that. So those are kind of my three keys to success. You know, I will see if they're actually make you successful or make me successful. But I think those are three important things to think about going forward.
Sorry, Elizabeth Charles.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I hope you are all doing well in we've hit 1 year of pandemic time, which is unbelievable. So I'm really glad to be here tonight and get to speak to you all. So I currently work as a historian at the Department of State. I work on researching and compiling the Foreign Relations of the United States series, which is the official documentary record of U.S. foreign relations with other countries. It is really incredible and a huge privilege to be able to do that work. And I got really lucky to get my job, quite frankly. Getting a federal history job is not the easiest thing in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but there are a lot of federal historians and a lot of federal history offices. So as an undergrad, keep that in mind. If you end up going to grad school and progress through with history or political science, there are opportunities in the federal government for people with your skill sets. So I was an undergrad history major at the University of Georgia. I will not say how long ago because it was longer than I care to admit. So I did my undergraduate in history. I took a year off because I thought when I was a history major that I was going to go to law school. I have 5 generations of lawyers in my family. And then I just ditched that idea to my father's great dismay and decided to go to grad school instead. So I got a master's first at Boston College in Russian and Cold War history. I wasn't yet sure if I wanted to do a PhD. I didn't quite know what track I wanted to take. So I did the master's and then ended up at George Washington for my PhD in Russian and Cold War history, which segued very well into my current job. But what I will say for advice and building on everything Justin said, which he stole a lot of my thoughts and ideas, as history undergraduates, you learn skills that are applicable to so many jobs. First off, you learn how to write. So many people today can't write well. And what a lot of history majors do and English majors write a lot, write all the time. And in the writing, you learn how to analyze, you learn how to think, you learn how to use evidence and documents in your writing. So that's a huge skill set that you can use in many different jobs. So, don't ever undervalue the things that seem really simple and fundamental about history majors. Another big skill set that I use every day in our office compiling the foreign relations is organization. So if you go out and you research and you end up with 400 documents, how do you organize them? How do you keep track of what you have? These are other skills that are applicable in many, many different jobs. As Justin said, we think about evidence. We know how to look at things. We know how to really be critical about documents that we're reading and think about who wrote them, why they wrote them, are they important? Did they make a difference in the history? So these are skills that you can really build on in a variety of jobs. We're in DC. There's tons of internships. There's also a lot of consulting jobs. I have a friend from grad school who ended up working for a consulting firm, and all she does is write grants. And it is a super niche skill set, but she got that job because she was a good writer and she knew how to think and she knew how to analyze. So there's a lot of different things you can do. I'm happy in the Q&A to talk more about how you get a federal job very briefly, if y'all are interested in that at all. But it's don't sell yourself short as history majors because we have a lot of skills that are really applicable to a lot of things. So I will leave it there and take questions later. So.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It seems that Nicholas Ross is not with us at the moment. He is he's one of also a AU history undergraduate alum, one of Peter Kuznick's proteges. and the director of the Stimson Center's Nuclear Security Program. Hopefully he will join us later in the hour, but for the time being, we will move on to Dana Stevenson, another very recent graduate with a BA in history at AU, who is currently teaching in the Montgomery County Public Schools.
Thank you so much. So it's true, I graduated in 2020. So what I lack in experience, hopefully I make up for in empathy for the uncertainty that a lot of undergrads might be experiencing right now, graduating during a pandemic. So I double majored at AU in history and secondary education, which is why I'm able to teach in a K-12 school system straight out of undergrad. Normally you'd have to do an MAT master's program for that. I can speak more about, like the job process if anyone's interested in getting hired in a public school system. I actually live with 2 other AU history undergrad graduates who are also teaching in public schools. So we've got a lot of combined knowledge on how to work around that system. In terms of the skills that I've learned as an AU undergrad, I don't want to echo too much what's already been said because, again, I think all of us take away that writing skill was just a huge one. Being able to think critically, right? If you want to get through a history program, you have to develop those skills, and those are transferable to so many different fields. I wish I had a little more opportunities to employ those writing skills as a teacher, but I can also talk more about avenues that you can do that during the summer and through professional development and things like that if you're interested in having that balance. Other skills that I've learned as an undergrad, I was reflecting on experiences that really stood out in forming me as a teacher. First, there are 2 kind of like polar opposite experiences that you wouldn't think would be the most important. The first would be obvious, which is the thesis class, right? It's the culminating experience of your undergraduate history major. And to me, that taught me a lot of patience, which you need as a teacher, certainly. It also taught me to be able to dig through digitized archives very quickly, or physical archives, which is useful as a teacher when I run into coworkers who are saying, let's just use a textbook, or let's just use this packet that we found online, right? And we want to always encourage students to build those critical thinking skills and be able to work with primary sources. So I kind of surprise coworkers sometimes by saying, oh, well, I know of this digital archive at such and such university that has sources on this. Let's see if we can find a primary source. And I find one pretty quickly. So having that skill of being able to comb through those digital resources and find things that you can use in the classroom to get students to think a little bit deeper has been a huge skill that I've learned from writing my thesis. The other experience that really shaped me was actually History 100. If you haven't taken it, don't sleep on it. It's not just for people who are getting a gen ed out of the way. The reason for taking those sort of, gen ed level, quote unquote, history classes for me was getting to understand how to make history relevant to someone who isn't necessarily invested in doing it as a career, right? So in a lot of History 100 classes, we would talk about ways that we felt that our high school education had failed us and taught us that history was, learning a discrete set of facts and dates and events and not really interrogating the past and thinking critically about it. So classes like that gave me the opportunity to talk about history to people who were studying IR, were studying poli-sci, but were interested in shifting the way that they think about history. And that helps me be a better teacher because, let's face it, most students in a public high school aren't necessarily interested in becoming historians, the majority. So it helped me think about how do I hook students into history and thinking about history in a critical way and making it relevant to people who don't consider themselves to be a history buff. And expand, kind of like what Justin said, our idea of what history is and what the act of doing history is. So those are 2 experiences that really impact me as a teacher right now. I just realized I forgot to mention like some basic information about my work if you're interested. So I teach at John F. Kennedy High School in Glenmont, all the way at the end of the red line. And I currently teach 9th grade US history, so post-Reconstruction to present, and then 11th grade modern world history, which is very broad. It's 1400s to the present. But the cool thing is that the whole second semester, we kind of speed through like 500 years, and then the second semester is just focused on the 20th century, which some people would call recent events rather than history. But to me, it really helps because, you know, I can draw on photos, documentaries, there's a lot more archival work that's been digitized that's available that I can pull on for students. You know, I can use radio clips, bring those into class. And it's easier to make it relevant because students can draw a more connect line between something that happened in 1920, for example, interwar period, rise of fascism, to what's going on today, right? We can make those connections because they're more recent and we can see, you know, those connections. So, but like I think it was Justin said, I do have to be a generalist, right? As a high school history teacher, I wrote my thesis on public health campaigns in the Spanish Civil War, and I got maybe 10 minutes to talk about Franco in my world history class. So I've taught about things that I haven't studied since I was in high school. Yeah, Mao Zedong's Little Red Book never came up in my AU history classes, but I had to teach about it. So yeah, those are the skills that I've had to draw on as a history teacher. If you have any more questions specifically about K-12 education or what's like teaching in a pandemic or anything like that, I'm happy to answer. But one piece of advice that I haven't heard yet that I would encourage you to think about is to think about what aspect of the act of doing history is most interesting to you. If you're most interested in the writing and the primary source research, I'm not trying to discourage anyone from teaching, but I wouldn't say that maybe K-12 education would be the route to go in because I just, you know, I don't have time to spend all my time poring over archives. As a K-12 teacher, I have IEP meetings and, you know, one-on-one meetings with students and grading and paperwork. So I would say be realistic about what aspect of history is most compelling to you. If you like talking to people about it and making it accessible to them, then I would definitely encourage some sort of K-12 education. If you like doing more of that original research, then I would say something more writing and research heavy, something to do with an institution like Department of State or so on. So yeah, keeping in mind, like, what do you want to be spending your everyday doing in your career? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. Well, why don't we take some questions now? We'd like to hear very much from you guys. You can either use the raise your hand button and I will call on you, or you can put your question into the chat and I can read out those questions. I know I've got lots of questions. Hopefully you guys have some questions to ask of our panelists as well. So I'll open it up now and let you guys ask your questions. Okay, well, we have one here. I'm not sure who this is directed to. Perhaps everyone on the panel can respond to it. What recommendations do you have for people who want to pursue a career in public history research, but did not major in history during undergrad? I want to get a master's in history, but I'm not sure what I can do or should do in between undergrad and grad school. Who would like to give that a stab?
I'll try to do that. Of course, I'll defer to the people who actually run history programs. But I think, you know, the big thing about master's programs, graduate programs is you read a lot. And so the more, when you're an undergraduate, you kind of get a primer in lots of different things. And so if you can spend that time between undergraduate and graduate school, just kind of picking an area that you're interested in and starting to maybe browse through some journals in that area or some notable works. And certainly professors can help you with that if you don't know where to start. But I think just starting to read and get a lay of the land to know what areas interest you and what areas you might actually want to do some research in would probably be the most helpful. And it gets you used to reading a lot too, and quickly.
Can I throw in something as well? And I meant to say this in my recommendations to all of you, but especially to this question, go talk to people. Talk to public historians, talk to people who work in museums, whoever you can talk to and bend their ear. Talk to them about what they do every day. Do they like it? What bothers them about it? You know, we all have things that we love doing in our jobs and things that are very tedious and mundane. So I would definitely just recommend, you know, we're in DC with tons of people, tons of public history scholars, you know, figure out what people do and what they like about it. And that's one actually recommendation I meant to say to all of you in the beginning is don't be afraid to approach people. You know, just because someone works like, you know, in my office for the Department of State, that sounds super important, whatever. I'm just a person. You know, I'm super happy to talk to people about my job, about what we do, and most people are. So don't think that people are unapproachable. Don't be afraid to email people. You know, if they don't have time to talk to you, they're just going to say, sorry, I don't have time. But they may recommend someone else in their office or another field or someone they know who can give you some guidance. So really, you know, try to network as much as you can. Go to events around DC when we finally have them again, and just, you know, try to meet people who are in these fields so you can really learn what it's like to work in these jobs from day to day.
Okay, well, we have several other questions here in the chat now. I think also Professor Shelford wanted to chime in here. So I'll let her go first and then Rachel, and then we'll do the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things quickly. One is that this person mentioned they were interested in public history. And in the second hour of this, we're going to have a couple of people who've gotten masters in public history, and they're going to be speaking, as well as one of our students who is now in a BA/MA program. So you can learn more about, and we're going to also have a PhD candidate. So you can learn a little bit more about that aspect in the second hour. But when it comes to, I'm now a historian, right? I mean, I got the PhD on the wall to prove it, all right? And I actually wrote a book. But I didn't take a single course in history as an undergraduate, not one. Okay, and those of you who have been in my class, you know that I always bore you the first session with this story, and I'm going to not do that this time around. But between my undergraduate work and my going back to graduate school in history to get a master's degree, it was 12 years. It was 12 years. Okay. Now there are some really good aspects of that, and perhaps some not so good aspects of it, but it was really perfect for me. And I was talking to a student today who was thinking about going on. History is not a field that if you decide that you want to go back and learn about it, that holds it against you, that you take a few years to figure out what you want to do. And this is really important. I mean, those kinds of experiences are valued, okay? So I think that's one thing. If you are interested in that, definitely a master's is the way to go. Actually, when I went back for my master's, I was working full time and I was taking master's classes at night. And then I shifted over where I had a teaching assistantship. And so I started, so then I was a full-time student. But that was perfect. It was perfect for me, really getting an understanding of just somebody who had learned to love history. What does it mean to do history at a point when I didn't know where that was going to go, dipping in and finding out about different fields of history that I might be interested in. And so, you know, it's really a great way to kind of start to break into the field. And that's all I have there.
Thank you so much, April.
Whoops, no.
We will get to Rachel in 1 second. I want to also tell you all that even though Nicholas Ross did not make it tonight, unfortunately, we do have with us now someone who has worked in the think tank world in the past and is one of our current PhD students. After we have some of these questions answered by a panelist, we can turn it over to him and he can tell us a little bit about how a history degree may help you to thrive in the think tank world. But first, let's tackle some of these questions that the attendees are asking. We'll start with Rachel.
Hi. So I'm an exchange student from the University of Toronto, Canada. And I'm just wondering, as a foreigner, particularly a Canadian, how difficult is it to break in to a stable job in history field in the United States, whether that would be through academia or a government job or something like that? And how valuable would a degree, I guess a grad school degree from the United States be in securing a position versus a Canadian grad school degree?
I can answer the federal part of that. You're going to have a hard time. Most federal jobs in the history field require a security clearance, which requires you to be a US citizen. So if you don't mind becoming a dual citizen, which is also, takes some time and effort, there are history jobs in places like National Park Service and some other offices that don't require security clearances, but most, especially military, State Department, DoD history jobs require clearances. So you do have to be a US citizen. I have lots of friends who I was in grad school with, who have degrees from all over. We do have one person in our office who grew up in Romania, came here in 1989, became a US, he's a dual citizen, but does have a clearance. So it's feasible to do it. But I think that Canadian degrees, in my opinion, and I will let everyone else chime in, seem just as applicable as US degrees. So I think it just depends on which route you want to go. And you don't have to go to grad school to break into federal history and other history fields, but I'll speak specifically about federal history. There are GS 7 and 9 positions that you can get into with an undergraduate degree and then move up the ladder. So, there are ways to do it, but you're going to come in as a 7, which is not very good pay grade to start with, but it's also a job and it gets you in the federal system. And once you're in the federal system, it's much easier to move up the ladder. So it's definitely something to consider, especially if that job is not in DC, which is a super expensive place to live. If you get one somewhere else and you're willing to move, it's a good way to start off a federal career.
I would just add that from everything I've heard, we have a place in Canada and a lot of relatives there, that if you do have Canadian citizenship, a US degree makes it's fine getting a job in Canada. So going that way is easier. And I also had a thought, William Davis asked a question about doing a second major or minor and whether that's something that is valuable. And I always say the same thing when people ask me that question. And I am not a fan of a second major because it locks you into a lot of courses that are required. And I think as an undergrad, you should take courses that you're passionate about and you care about. And so checking off boxes for 2 majors is not the way to do it, I don't think. I think the thing that really, if you're applying to graduate school in history, the thing that really sets candidates apart is writing a knockout senior thesis. We read senior theses when we look at grad applications, and that is something that can transform everything. No matter what school you go to as an undergrad, it's something that can get you in if you do a knockout senior thesis or something like publishable quality article length as well.
I'll also add that, it doesn't have, your skills don't have to show up on your transcript, but they have to be demonstrable. So I talked about digital history, and that's a lie. I had to take 2 digital history courses, but a majority of my skills and my knowledge just came from doing it. And so they wouldn't show up on my transcript, but they would show up on my CV, on my resume. So, you know, I like Professor Laura said, I wouldn't necessarily think about locking yourself in to try to get skills. You know, skills are free, and it just takes the time to do it. And if you can demonstrate that you can do those things, I think that's all the better. And as to answer the issue about Canadian citizenship and degrees, you know, if in the private sector, at least, you know, a degree is a degree, and certainly Canadian graduate degrees are well known here in the United States as well. You know, we don't like to talk about name recognition, but it does, I think, help that if someone who's reading your resume knows the school that you potentially got a master's degree from. So, you know, University of Toronto would obviously carry more weight than, I don't even know any other universities in Canada. So maybe out somewhere in the Yukon or something like that. You know, like that's, sure. And so, you know, there are those kinds of internal biases that we don't like to talk about. We try to not give into, but they do happen. Which is not to say that you have to pay to go to University of Toronto if you can get somewhere funded else.
To try to answer really quickly from the public education perspective, both of those questions. I'm not sure if you're interested, Rachel, in K-12 education, but just to throw it out there, having an education from another country shouldn't be a deterrent at all in terms of hiring. Actually, a lot of my coworkers grew up and were educated in other countries before coming to the US, so they're always looking for teachers. So it's more about the quality of your transcript and your interview and like previous experience working with young people. In terms of the question about a second major, coming from someone who did a second major, I would actually have to echo what Dr. Laura said and caution against it if you don't need it. My reason for doing it was unique in that, you know, going into K-12 education, you need that certification. And from a financial standpoint, I didn't want to spend an extra year or so getting that certification if I could knock it out in undergrad. That was the reasoning. That being said, I had a couple times talking in Professor Finley's office, like telling her how I was frustrated that, you know, having to fill out all these education requirements really limited me. I also had to student teach and all this stuff that really knocked out most of my flexibility my senior year of college. So if you can, just do the one major and then take other classes that interest you, that can actually really help you like develop those other skills that you don't need an entire second major for. In order to get those extra experiences, I really had to advocate for myself. So for example, I wanted to study abroad. I wanted to work on my Spanish in Madrid, which helped me a lot. I work at a majority Spanish speaking school now, so I use Spanish every day. And in order to do that and have flexibility with my major, I had to beg the history department to let me do an independent study to knock out some history credits while I was in Madrid because they didn't have upper level courses at the program in Madrid. So if you do a second major, for whatever reason it might be, like for myself, it was more financial, you have to be your own advocate and find other ways to get those extra experiences, those extra skills and educational opportunities, just knowing that you won't have as much flexibility. But if you don't need a certain certification or something, I don't think you need a second major.
Hi everyone, to introduce myself, I'm Reza Akbari. I'm a second year PhD student at the history department. My background is in the nonprofit world, think tank world in Washington, DC. And, you know, for the context of this meeting, I've also had extensive experience with reviewing resumes when it comes to hiring interns, other entry positions like program assistants and program associates for the think tank world. You know, to kind of emphasize something that has come up already, believe it or not, and this is something that, you know, a lot of academics actually don't want to hear, is that the degree is secondary oftentimes to why you end up with a job in the think tank world, at least. Typically what the people in the think tank world look for are skills, tangible skills. If you're a good writer, if you're a good editor, if you're really good at working with spreadsheets, if you know, a design application that they use for publications, these are the ways that, you know, get your foot in the door, so to speak. This is what I learned the hard way, and oftentimes it's uncomfortable, and not that many people tell you this, but you can't really become a scholar or become, you know, kind of a heavy hitter or get a senior position by just working in the think tank field. I'll elaborate on that a little bit. Is what makes you a scholar is having a PhD, having written a few books, or having had extensive experience in the government in some capacity. The think tank, you know, people look at your degree as context. You know, they look at your, dissertations, either master's or bachelor's, for context. And they want kind of a base level or basic level of understanding, and they want to see that you have a handle, you know, on a geographical area that you might be working on, or on a thematic area that you might be working on. But what they advertise for and what they want you to demonstrate in your resume, and or sometimes they give you tangible quizzes and tests on the interview, I've done that many times, is I'm looking for a junior editor. So I'm actually looking for someone who can edit my work, who can edit the work of someone who's in a more senior capacity in a project, in a field, or in a program working at a think tank. So that's something that you need to work on and be able to demonstrate and prove, essentially. Now, these type of skills are things that you can certainly gain by being in a history program. You know, as I'm sure you have and are, but they're not going to kind of essentially make or break you if you have a history, degree versus a poli-sci degree or a sociology degree, because ultimately these are going to be entry-level positions, and the person who's working at a think tank as a scholar, like for better or worse, already thinks they know everything. So they are not looking for another scholar. They are looking for someone that brings them tangible skills. And I can elaborate on that more if you guys have questions about what these tangible skills are and how you can, kind of demonstrate them.
Thanks, Reza. Yeah, I mean, certainly some of those tangible skills one would imagine you can get in history as well as some of the other social science disciplines. We'll come back to you in 1 second here. I want to ask some of the questions that are being asked in the chat here. One that Mackenzie raises is, for graduate school, what are the differences in uses between a master's degree or a PhD? I'm assuming what she means, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Mackenzie, is what kinds of jobs perhaps would you be eligible for if you had a master's degree, and what kind of jobs would you be eligible for if you had a PhD? Yes, that is her question. Okay. Anyone would like to respond?
I can jump in on the, you do not need a PhD to be a federal historian. I will say that right off the bat. A lot of people in my office have PhDs, but probably half of the people in my office have master's degrees. There are definitely entry-level history positions. The Air Force, for instance, so every wing of the Air Force has a historian that travels with the wing and writes the history of the wing. Those are usually very entry-level positions of probably people who have undergrads in history. You can have a master's and also get those positions. It just kind of depends on your ability. I think, and I'll let everyone else chime in, The only thing you really need a PhD to do is teach at a university. Getting a PhD, however, having done it and taken a long time to do it and been very slow at it, it does give you, it hones in your research skills, it hones in your writing, because you're writing a 200, 300, 400-page dissertation that's much bigger than a master's thesis. So it just really works your skill set in a different way. So I think it's up to you if you want to do it. If you want to try to teach on the college level, you definitely need it. But for other positions, I think a master's really gives you a lot of opportunity.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to respond to that question? Okay, well, there are a bunch of questions about grad school that maybe are best kept for the second panel, but Robert asks a question here. This is a broad question, but how do you begin the process of finding a job in the field of history? Whether it's straight out of undergrad or after grad school, where do you start and how does it differ between different fields? Because it all seems a bit overwhelming. Does it have a lot to do with connections?
The short answer to every part of that question is yes. There are lots of different places that you can look, and yes, it does have to do with connections, and it doesn't though too. So some places I think that would be helpful to start looking for positions is first, network as best you can. Find a place that you could envision yourself working. Contact someone there, and this is something Elizabeth talked about earlier, and talk to that person. And while there may not be a job available for you there, that person can then kind of point you to other places that are somewhat similar that might be hiring. The other thing is that as an undergraduate, this may not be so useful, but if you can join professional organizations that are of interest to you. So, if you really like foreign relations, you might join the Society for Historians of Foreign Relations, American Foreign Relations. And oftentimes they will send out job openings. So the way I found out about my job was I was part of one of these organizations, and they sent out an email that there was an opening, and I didn't even know this place existed or even this industry existed. But I saw it and I applied, and I was lucky enough to get the job. But a lot of it's networking, it's just getting to know different people in different places, and finding a place that might be good for you that you didn't even know about it. But because you've made those connections, you can, you can apply for it. And one of the nice things about the academic setting program is that you get to know lots of people who are kind of doing the same thing as you, who have similar interests as you. I mean, I met my wife in Professor Lohr's class. And so while that may not say much about Imperial Russia, it does say something about the camaraderie that goes on in a history program. So get to know as many people as you can, even if it is sometimes painful and awkward for history people.
Wow, you're not the only one. There was another couple that met in my freshman seminar one time.
You've got the juice, I guess. I don't know.
I should have gone into matchmaking. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Justin. Reza, can you add something to that? Are connections important in the think tank world?
Yes, and yes. I can't overemphasize how important that is. And I also completely commiserate with how daunting that could be. I personally, come from a family that has no political background per se, and you kind of see those divisions when you, even at a young age, when you're working as an intern in different think tanks and so on and so forth, you kind of recognize that some people are coming in already with with family connections, with professional connections established through other means. So that's something that is a big challenge, and people need to overcome for sure. Now, the good thing about DC, though, having said that, is that there are existing structures that help you actually to build those connections. One thing that, again, I know everything we say these days, we also have to preface because we're in the middle of a pandemic as well. So that's also getting harder to do. But events, there are so many events that are happening in Washington, DC. And even on their own, they're overwhelming. It seems like there are like dozens of events happening every day. But coming up with a strategy to actually go to the events where you think you're interested in the topic. There are individuals in that event either speaking or could potentially be in the audience that could be useful for you. These are individuals that are perhaps in organizations that you like. They're working on topics and themes that you like. And ultimately not being shy, approaching them, giving them your cards or getting their business cards, and then following up with them after these events. Standing up and asking a question helps a lot because it kind of establishes your presence in the room, and kind of demonstrates that you have some kind of an academic affiliation as a student, or you perhaps are already an intern with a well-known organization. So things of that nature, I think, are very helpful and also tiring, because you honestly need to be very proactive when it comes to establishing these connections and networks. And just kind of on an emotional level, I know DC is full of individuals that may seem kind of like alpha types, go-getter types, type A personalities. It could be very intimidating, but if it's comforting at any level, anyone in DC has been where you are. So there is, kind of a level of understanding, and there is a culture of pay it forward as well. Of course, you're gonna encounter individuals that are not going to be that helpful, but for the most part, individuals have an understanding, given their age or where they are 5 years before you approach them, 6 years, 10 years, 20 years before you approach them. They've been exactly where you are now. So there is an understanding, and as much as they can, they do help, and it's kind of part of the unspoken culture of the city as well.
Thank you so much, Reza. And one would imagine another way to sort of get your foot in the door and make some of these connections is through internships. Professor Shelford has a few things that she'd like to say about that, and I'll chime in.
Okay, unfortunately, I don't have a lot to say about that, and we don't have the person who coordinates history department internships. But I think everybody who goes to AU knows that one of the things that we do as a university is provide internships. And there are internships in the history major, okay, where you can earn credit by creating an internship. These are pretty serious things, because we don't want people to spend a semester at the copying machine, okay? And so it's the kind of thing that you want to be thinking ahead for. And on the website, there's information about internships in history and how you arrange that and how you get credit for it. But I do believe that MJ is responsible for that. She does a terrific job, and she's exactly the kind of person who's very interested in helping students to do that kind of work. So in addition to other kinds of internships in the university, the history department does coordinate its own internships. So definitely take a look on the website and you'll find out more information about that. I think, Justin, we've actually placed interns in history associates, but I'm not sure of that, but I think that that's happened.
That's right. I've only been there about 1.5 years, but last year we had Katie McCarthy.
Right.
There. We don't have anybody this year. It may have something to do with COVID. I'm not sure.
Okay. So that's, yeah.
Yes, and I think on occasion we also do send out announcements for internships via the undergraduate major and minor listserv. So if you're getting those emails, open them up, and there may be opportunities available to you through the listserv. Well, we're very fast running out of time here, and we have another panel at 8 o'clock. There were a whole bunch of questions that I wanted to ask too. I'm really curious to know who Justin's clients are. I'm not sure he can speak to that or not, but I'd like to have a sense of why they've turned to historians for their consulting needs.
Sure. So like I said, we do a lot of different things. The biggest part of our business is probably litigation research. So people who are being sued and need some kind of historical evidence for why they shouldn't be held accountable for something. I can't divulge those, but think of the biggest companies in the world, and we've probably worked for them at some level. But we also do a lot of public history. So I think the Statue of Liberty Museum, we did work for the World War II Museum in New Orleans, all kinds of big public history. But it's also kind of like these little niche projects too. So I mentioned the fajita capital of the birthplace of the fajita or whatever. So we work for, like, Kyle, Texas wants to be known, wants to market themselves as the birthplace of the fajita. So they'll get in touch with us. Or like Remy Martin has a corporate anniversary and they want us to do a timeline or a book or something like that. So anybody and everybody is sort of our client base. And it makes things really interesting.
That's great.
Can I chime in with one very interesting tidbit? I went to, I'm sure most of you hopefully are familiar with the NCPH, the National Council on Public History meetings. And I was doing the speed networking, and the other historian at my table was the historian for Levi Strauss. So her entire job was to write the history of the company that created Blue Jeans. So there are historians everywhere. So to the question about where do you find a job, cast a wide net, because there are historians all over. There are corporate historians, Coca-Cola has historians. I mean, so there's a lot of really cool stuff. And I know History Associates does a lot of really interesting stuff like that too. But I was fascinated by her, and she had such a cool job. So, think outside the box.
And to add something really quick, that's the same thing goes with nonprofit organizations and think tanks in Washington, D.C. A lot of nonprofit organizations, especially within the past 10 to 15 years, they produce booklets and brochures and, almost 30, 40 page, kind of books, if you will, or booklets that kind of highlights and chronologically explains the history of their organization. Now, depending on the number of years that organization that has been active, so you have to kind of target the older, kind of more established entities. But that's also something that historians do, and if not on a full-time basis, at least contractually, they work with organizations to kind of write the history of their activities and impact in the policy circles.
Well, thank you to you all. I wanted to ask you all, what does the job market look like? But maybe what we can do is we can turn it over to John Charles from the AU Career Center, and he can tell us how we can go about getting a job here.
Thanks so much, Professor. And what a fabulous panel. I learned a lot myself, and so that's always a good thing. So I would say that in the Career Center, we can offer 30-minute and 60-minute appointments in which we will discuss with you, of course, your whole job search, your internship searches, but also how do you go about networking? And we had a great discussion about that. And one thing that I think is really helpful is to think about, rather than the big wigs downtown and the famous people we all read about, your classmates, especially older students for younger students or grad students. It was really great to have Reza here. I really appreciated your perspective. there's so many people on campus who we can help you connect with. So I just want to say that hidden underneath, and once we get back in person, of course, it will be a little bit easier. But even now, there are certainly ways that we can help you to make those connections and show you exactly how to do it. So I would encourage you to visit us over at, I'll type in our URL in the chat, and then my email is charles@american.edu. And my colleagues, Anna Littman and Marie Spalding, of course, look forward to meeting with all of you as well. So I hope that those are a few ways that you can get plugged in with us.
Well, thank you so much, John. Thank you all for your participation in this panel. We hope that we can have you all back in the future, but in the flesh. We have another panel at 8 o'clock. Maybe we take 30 seconds to stretch our legs and blink a couple of times, and then we'll come back and talk about graduate and law school futures at 8:03, let's say. Thank you so much. Okay, well, welcome back. It's 8:03, so I apologize that we're running a few minutes late here. Again, we have a panel now about graduate school, about law school. We're very happy to have these 5 panelists here. I don't want to spend a lot of time again giving lengthy introductions. I'd rather turn it over to the panelists and let them introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about graduate school and law school for us. So let's begin with Hannah Byrne.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be with y'all tonight. So my name is Hannah Byrne, and I guess a little bit about me. I have a bachelor's degree in history from Birmingham Southern College, which is like a tiny liberal arts school in Birmingham, Alabama. And then I have a master's degree in public history from AU, and I graduated in 2019, so about 2 years ago I finished that up. And now currently I work in the Institutional History Division at the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives, where I help manage a Smithsonian oral history program with Smithsonian community members. And that collection has been running since 1973, so it's a pretty large collection. I conduct research on the history of the institution. I provide reference and work with researchers also interested in that topic. And I work on public programs and exhibits related to the history of the Smithsonian. Previously, I worked at the White House Historical Association, where I worked in museum education. And then I worked at the DC History Center as a conference manager for the annual DC History Conference in 2019. And then I also worked at Whitman Walker Health, which, if you're not familiar, is a local health center in Washington, DC that specializes in LGBTQ+ care. And I worked with them on an oral history collection on the intersection of HIV/AIDS, Washington, DC, and Whitman Walker. And I worked with them kind of building that collection and then also working on kind of developing an archive and institutional history over there. And looking forward to talking more about grad school and all the things AU has to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. What we're going to do, what we're going to do is we're going to have everybody introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their background and hopefully about their graduate degrees or the how should I say, the benefit of these particular degrees, and then we'll open it up to questions like we did with the first panel. So Lena Mann is next, I think.
Hi, hello. So my name is Lena Mann. I currently work as a historian at the White House Historical Association, and in this role, you know, we are a private nonprofit organization, so we do history about the White House. Recently, I've been involved in an initiative called Slavery in the President's Neighborhood, where we've tracked the enslaved people that built the White House and worked at the White House. So that has been a big project that I have been involved in. But I want to talk a little bit about how I got here, because I think that everyone's journey, it can be really instructive. So I got my bachelor's degree from St. Mary's College of Maryland in 2016, a bachelor's in history. And then following my undergraduate studies, I really wasn't sure about what my next steps would be. I thought I wanted to work in history or the museum field, but I didn't really exactly know what kind of work I wanted to do. I've always considered myself sort of a generalist, and I'd worked in, you know, museum studies, exhibit development, all sorts of different elements of what public history or history jobs can be. But when I graduated, I was pretty lost. So I ended up doing 3 programs with AmeriCorps and the Student Conservation Association. I spent some time working for an environmental organization called Duke Farms, where I did museum education. And I learned in that role that that was not for me. I don't really love doing museum education. So after that, I ended up working for Sitka National Historical Park, which is in Alaska. There I got to do, I was a museum technician and helping to manage their totem pole collection. It was a really cool job, but once again, it was very archival based, very collections based, and I realized I don't really want to work with material culture or archives full time. So another learning experience. And then the third thing I did in that year gap was I worked for Arches National Park as an interpretive ranger, and that's kind of where I found what I really like to do. And I realized that a public history path or anything with public programming was more my speed and what I wanted to pursue. So that is how I decided I wanted to go to American University to pursue my master's degree. So I did that. I also applied to some PhD programs at the time, but I was also very underprepared, and I would recommend if you do apply to PhD programs that you are much more prepared than I was at the time. I was really flying in blind, and I didn't have a lot of people that had similar experiences or pursued a PhD, so that can be really challenging. But for me, the main positive of pursuing a graduate degree was that it did allow me to, A, more deeply engage with the practice of history, but also most importantly, it allowed me to get a job. Originally, I wanted to work full-time with benefits in the field without a graduate degree. And at that time, it just was not feasible. And I imagine it's still not in light of recent events. So the master's degree is one of the main reasons I am where I am today. But I also like to say that it is not for everyone. You can make it work if you really, really want to. There are jobs like in the National Park Service where you can work with history without having a master's degree. But I do think that pursuing a graduate degree does make it easier in the field of history. And then finally, I would say one of my biggest pieces of advice is to take time out between undergrad and grad school. That is what I did. I think it is imperative to work in the field and know more about what exactly you want to do, what kind of career you want, also what type of lifestyle you want to live when you're looking for and choosing a program. And in my experience, the students that worked before returning to school had a clearer focus and were more prepared for their programs. And I personally wish I had taken even another year in between my undergrad and graduate studies. So that is what I will say to introduce myself.
Thank you, Lena. Next up is Laith Shocker, who is another one of our AU undergraduate alums. I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you, Petra. Yes, my name is Laith. I graduated from AU in 2017, the bachelor's in history and philosophy. Shortly after that, I decided to pursue a master's degree in history at SOAS, the University of London. And that kind of put me where I'm at now. So I'm in the second year of a joint PhD in history and Middle Eastern studies at New York University. I laughed actually initially when Pedram invited me to be on this panel on careers, because technically I'm not quite at that stage yet. I'm still in graduate school, and the state of history as a field maybe makes the career prospect a little more frightening. So on that bright note, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of why I decided to pursue a graduate degree, and some of the positives and negatives I found both pursuing a master's and now here at the PhD. It was really while I was working on my undergrad senior thesis that I realized that history felt like a field I could contribute to, or I could see myself contributing to. My undergrad thesis was on the politics of nationalism and archaeology in modern Iraq. And as I was doing my research, I found there was not a lot of literature really deeply interrogating the connections between the ancient past and kind of modern political movements. And that kind of springboarded me to my master's thesis, which kind of shifted to the history of tourism in the Middle East, or in Iraq specifically, again, focusing on kind of the Thomas Cook Company, which again was an angle that I hadn't really seen investigated in the literature. And when I got into the archives, I just found more and more really ample primary source material that I kind of let that kind of guide my research. Now at NYU, I'm pursuing kind of on the same kind of beat, but a broader history of tourism in Iraq, kind of zooming out from just looking at Thomas Cook to looking at the phenomenon more broadly. Yeah, so that's all to say that my decision to pursue kind of the academic route was motivated. I was kind of on the same sort of path starting with my senior thesis, but a lot of my colleagues here at NYU, it was a very different story for them, kind of found their topics as they were developing in graduate school. And in terms of some of like the positives and negatives of my graduate studies, the positives are mainly I'm a giant nerd, so I really appreciated the opportunity to really get paid to read as a PhD student. It's been a very good experience for me so far, despite everything that's happening. And some of the obvious cons are, I alluded to kind of the state of the academic job market. I don't want to be flippant about it. I'm sure Pedram and other professors who are here can attest to this, but I think you should be realistic kind of about what things are going to look like perhaps after the PhD, but we're historians, we can't tell the future necessarily, so take that with a grain of salt. And it is a big commitment, devoting kind of 5 to potentially 7 years of your life in graduate school. And even though hopefully you are being funded enough to at least live on, it's not exactly a glamorous lifestyle. So that's kind of a very real consideration if you decide to go the PhD route. And in terms of advice, I'm happy to talk in more detail about the kind of the application process for doctoral programs in the Q&A session if people have questions. But I think a major piece of advice I would give would be to, if you're sure you want to do kind of doctoral research and you haven't done language study, I would try to kind of focus on sort of research languages before applying, really both developing your topic, but kind of your research skills. I think that will help you in that process. And really developing your connections with your professors at AU. And if you decide to apply for a PhD, kind of reaching out to your potential advisors, current graduate students at those programs, kind of developing those connections before you apply. Yeah, so that's a little bit about where I'm coming from in terms of this question of graduate school, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session, and I'll also provide my email. Feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laith. Now we will turn it over to our esteemed colleague, Gautam Rao, who will talk about law school.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you this evening. Nice to see some familiar names as well among the participant list, and students and former students as well. So nice to be here. So I am a professor in the history department, as many of you know. I did all my degrees at the University of Chicago, much like my esteemed co-host here, Pedram. And so I along the way, got very interested in legal history, which is what I ended up doing my PhD in. That put me in the weird kind of in-between world of history and law. And ended up being a fellow at a couple law schools, including NYU, for the most substantial period of time as a fellow anywhere in my career. And that was really kind of a springboard for me. And since then, I've kind of always had one foot in the law school world and the other in the history world. My first job out of grad school was at Rutgers Newark, NJIT in Newark, New Jersey, where I started the pre-law program there and was the pre-law advisor for the university. And so I've since then, I've kind of had an abiding interest in the overlapping worlds of history and law. Those of you who read the newspapers, such as they exist these days, will see, of course, news about law is frequently connected to history. I'm also the editor of a journal called Law and History Review, which is a leading scholarly venue for discussions of these overlapping worlds. And so over the years, I've built up a lot of friendships and cultivated a lot of scholarly networks within law schools, and see continue to see how influential the field of history is, but also people who have a background in it, who go on to work in the legal profession, go through law school to the legal profession. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about perhaps what about a history degree might help you position you in applying for law school, but also in the much more niche world of those of you interested in the JD PhD route, which is another growing route you see at some major research universities for the ability to get 2 degrees and put you in a kind of uniquely well-positioned spot in the job market. So I'm happy to talk about all those things and anything in between as well. But thanks for having me today.
Thanks, Calvin. Finally, we have Kay Walter, who is another one of our history undergraduate alums, and she's currently in the BA/MA program here. So I'll turn it over to her.
Hey everyone, my name is Kai. No worries. I graduated from American U's undergrad history program actually last May, and then I'm in the BA/MA program for public history, which means that I am working on my MA right now, also at American. So I took some of my MA classes during my last years of undergrad, and theoretically could graduate in 5 years with both my BA and MA. However, because of COVID and also wanting to work, I decided to spread my MA into 2 years. So that means I'll be graduating with that next May, not this one, but next May. And so the reason I decided to do the BA/MA program is because I already knew a lot of the history professors at AU. I already had connections and relationships with them and with the campus and with DC. So I wanted to continue building on those and the projects that I've already started doing rather than starting over somewhere else. At some point, I do wish that I would have taken a break in between my BA and MA, like Lena mentioned. However, I'm in it right now, and while burnout can be an issue sometimes, especially with online school, I'll say I do appreciate that I can just keep going, and then once I'm done with it. That could have been 5 years, but like I said, it'll be 6, which is also fine, and that means that I'm only taking 2 classes a semester now, so I have more time to work or intern and build up my professional resume at the same time that I'm working on my academic resume, for lack of a better term. I'm also a fellow for the Humanities Truck. I don't know if how many of you are familiar with that, but it's essentially a sort of a converted food truck that is used to put on exhibits and do oral history. So going around DC, doing a lot of community-based and community-engaged history. And so I'm also building and continuing relationships with people in DC outside of academia, which I appreciate a lot. And so that fellowship has been great because, I mean, it's hard to do much of that right now during COVID, as most of what we do are events, and those are kind of slightly illegal right now. But so I do enjoy that because it's getting me out of the campus and actually having a chance to do history. So I'm learning about what I'm doing in the classroom. I'm able to put that into practice and also figure out what I want to do in terms of a career after I'm done with the MA. So I think that's most of it. I would say I've had a lot of stress about picking out classes and deciding what I'm going to do, especially because I took all of or most of my electives as an undergrad. And so now looking back, I've had some times where I am wondering if the electives I really took, what will they do for me in the future and getting a job. But after talking with professors and a number of my peers, a lot of people don't really know what they're doing yet or have an exact plan of what they want to do after they graduate. And so I found that I'd rather take the classes that I'm interested in because I'll still gain the skills of learning how to read and write and communicate. And I'll be more engaged if I'm interested in the material. And then for specific job-based skills that I might need to know, whether that's programming or curation or working with material culture as an archive, something like that, I can learn that on the job or through internships. So willing to speak more about any of that or answer any questions. Yeah, thanks for having me here though.
Thanks, Kai. Well, Nicholas Ross is with us now, so we will turn it over to him for a few minutes so that he can tell us a little bit about how his history degree from AU has helped him in his professional career. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Thank you so much, and I sincerely apologize for being so late. Unfortunately, one of the issues with COVID world is you're at the whims of the technology in your home at any given moment. So I was finally able to get it working. My name is Nicholas Roth. I'm the director of the Nuclear Security Program at the Stimson Center. And I can say in complete sincerity that the nearly 20 years that I've spent working on nuclear policy issues began with my education in the history department at American University. I was a history student. I sort of knew what I wanted to be learning about, but I had no real focus. And one day I stumbled across a series of courses related to the decision to use the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on Cold War history. And something about that topic really clicked in my mind. And I took a course with Peter Kuznick, and that summer I was off to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for his course. And it was really that experience in Japan that changed my trajectory in terms of what I wanted to study and what I wanted to do with my life. I was sort of dumbfounded by how little I knew about this incredibly important topic, and really overwhelmed from in the experience of speaking to actual survivors who lived through the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I came back from that course convinced that this is what I wanted to study and this is what I wanted to focus on. I drove my friends crazy in undergrad talking about nuclear weapons issues and wanting to learn more. I dove into the topic as much as I possibly could. And when I graduated, it really took some time to get a job that actually paid me in the field. My first job, I worked part-time for a PhD student in the history department at American University. He had a full-time job at a think tank. I did editing work for him, and then he tossed me some research tasks on the side, and we did that for a couple years till I could get a real job working on nuclear weapons policy issues. And one of the things that I immediately discovered, what I do now is very different than what I learned in the history program. And what I did in my early years after my undergraduate experience. But with that sort of solid foundation of my history education, I started learning the policy process. How does nuclear weapons policy actually get crafted? What role can I play in having an impact on these issues that I learned to care so much about in my undergraduate experience? And I think one of the really valuable things that has stayed with me, and I think about regularly from my undergraduate experience, is that when you talk about nuclear weapons policy, it's really, really easy to get quickly into abstract ideas where you're disconnected from actual people and human impacts. And one of the valuable things from my education at AU is that it grounded me in the human experience of what these issues are really about. And I make sure that whenever I'm doing any, whatever I'm doing in this policy area, that I'm sort of thinking back to that first experience and really trying to connect with how is this helping the people who first identified me, who helped me first identify with this issue, and how is this helping to protect people or prevent the tragedies that I saw firsthand on the ground again. And I'm happy to talk more about, and I guess one of the other questions that I was asked about is, what advice would I give? And one of the things that really helped me with that initial experience, and then along the way in supporting me, is developing relationship with the professors and the programs who can either nurture your interest in something or help you along the way. I really feel like having those relationships was a really key part in sort of fostering interest in this topic for me. And so I'm happy to talk about my initial interest in this. I'm happy to talk about more of the policy work that I do, or how they connect. I'm open to talk about any of those things. Thanks.
Well, thank you to our panelists. I want to turn it over to our attendees to ask our dear guests any questions that they may have. Again, as before, use the raise your hand button or put the question in the chat, and off we go. Okay, well, we have a question for Laith here. So Vincenza asks, what advice do you have for people who might be interested in pursuing a history graduate degree abroad? What do you wish you knew during your applications process?
Thank you for the question, Vincenza. I think my primary piece of advice would be to choose a program kind of for the program's sake, rather than like for a desire to live in a particular place, if that makes sense. Because it's taking time out kind of to do a graduate degree abroad and kind of moving, the allure of being in another place, I think, is very powerful, but it takes money, it takes time. So my primary piece of advice then, maybe it seems a little contradictory, but would be to kind of like make sure that you're choosing a program for the program's sake, specifically. So for me, for example, I chose to study at SOAS, the University of London, because I had studied abroad there. I did a semester there, but also because they were one of the, maybe not so much these days, but they're known for being one of the strongest sort of programs for the history of the modern Middle East. And being there helped me kind of develop the connections and also proximity to some of the archival resources I needed for my research. In terms of advice for the applications process, I would try to see kind of what resources that particular university has that you feel would help you develop both for your academic life, but also like for professional life. So things like career centers or kind of initiatives that the university is really known for, and make sure you mention that sort of thing in your application. I mean, that's just general advice, not specific for a university abroad. And I guess my other piece of advice would be to look out for fellowship funding or grants that are not restricted by nationality. So I was lucky enough for my master's thesis to get funding from an organization that didn't restrict their money based on citizenship, which is the case for quite a few programs. I mean, both here in the US, but also internationally. So kind of just be on the lookout for pockets of money that you can apply to regardless of your citizenship status. That kind of my experience in applying for the master's degree. And I'm glad I did it, but it's also not a course that's available for everyone for various reasons. But
Thank you, Laith. Other questions? Any other questions for our guests here? Yes, Tiba has a question here for Laith also. I'm interested in Iraqi history, and I was wondering if you have any advice regarding pursuing a less common field. A less common field of graduate study, one would imagine. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. As Pedram can attest to, I love the AU history department. It's a great place, but as someone who was kind of interested in history of the modern Middle East, I really kind of latched on to Pedram from the beginning as like my guiding light in the department. And I found out pretty quickly that, as you pointed, I mean, Iraqi history has grown in prominence, but it's still a relatively understudied field, as you know, but this goes for kind of any understudied historical field. You really want to try to find people whose work really speaks to you and get in touch with them. I think there's this sense of like propriety that scares us from reaching out to a professor, and we feel like, oh, you know, I don't really know this person, I don't want to bother them. But I found that for the most part, people are really willing to help out, especially if you're interested in their research or the sorts of questions they're interested in. And so I really encourage you to get in touch with people whose work interests you, especially if you're in kind of a smaller subfield, because we all got to stick together, right, in this world. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much of the panel's time talking about Iraqi history specifically, but I'll put my email in the chat if you want to get in touch about that.
Yes, I mean, in fact, I would like to have everyone, all of the panelists, add their emails to the chat if anyone wants to get in touch with, any of the attendees want to get in touch with you personally, privately. April would like to make a few comments about just generally the PhD application process for those of you who may be interested. And then we have a couple more questions here.
Yeah, this is just very general advice. First of all, I really want to underscore the point that if there's a historian out there who's doing work that you're excited about, contact that person. All right. And it really is true. I have found that in the historical profession, people tend to be very generous. If they don't want to talk to you, you're going to know it right away. Okay. But what have you lost? Okay. If you're applying for a PhD program, you've learned you don't want to work with that person. Okay, and this is an important thing to learn too. But the vast majority of people are more than happy to answer your questions, to find, you know, and to help you find out more about the various programs they're teaching and what they do. So that is just such an important piece of advice. And I realize it's very tough. I still have you know, it's like you feel like you're making a cold call, but this is what we do. Okay, and I think academics really, really want to see people who care about their work and who want to continue on the work of historical research, writing, and teaching. You know, we have an investment in the future too. So this is, you know, this is kind of an important thing. A couple of really, really very practical things is think carefully about your recommenders. Okay, choose them carefully. If you've been doing a 482, if you've been doing a 480, 481, then almost certainly that's a person that you're going to want to be able to write to you, because they're somebody who can speak very directly to the fact that you have already begun to acquire a lot of the skills that you're going to need to build on and develop in graduate school. So you want to think very carefully about your recommenders and talk to your recommenders for advice. I always say more advice is better. Now, you will get conflicting advice and you will have to make a choice, but it's better to have more advice than less advice. And the last thing I would say is when it comes to writing, and this is a monster, right? Writing the personal statement for graduate school is just a horrible experience, okay? It is so difficult to do. Ask people who've written your recommendation for you or who are willing to write recommendations, ask them to look at it. Okay, they can help you with, you know, small editorial things, but they've also probably read a lot of essays And they can probably tell you, like, you know what, every essay starts out telling me how much they love history. Okay, so that's not really telling your committee anything really. Okay, how can we make this work for you a little bit better? And frequently buried in that essay is something that you can pick up and you can move to the front that will make a much more compelling essay that people will want to read. Okay, so that's another thing too, is share, ask for advice, and get that kind of feedback, and all of that should help you a little bit. That's just very practical advice and on the program. And I know, you know, Professor Rao is also the head of our he's our director of graduate studies. So I'm sure that he might have more. And he's sat and he's read a lot of these files, and he may have additional things to say of a very practical nature.
Professor Rao, would you like to comment? If not, I have a question for you from Zoe.
I saw the question. I'll speak to this since we're on the topic of the applications. I'll just do that quickly. Yeah, it is admission season right now, in fact, and we're doing applications as our committee. What Professor Shelford said, all of it is sage advice. I'll just add a couple more little items. In your personal statement, it helps to be as direct as possible in mentioning exactly with whom you'd like to work at the place that you're applying to. And what other people on the faculty you might want to work with, because it really does show that you've done your homework. Really try to avoid having a kind of generic boilerplate type language that's going to be nonspecific and inapplicable to the place you're applying. So things like that, I think, are really important. And the other thing is, again, Professor Shelford mentioned this, but I'll just follow up. Contacting the people that you'd like to work with ahead of time and creating some sense of rapport, some set of knowledge about each other is really important, because when you sit down as a committee to make decisions, you remember the people with whom you've spoken. And I think it really does matter a lot. And you can really reinforce the things that your recommenders are going to mention in letters as well. You might want to coordinate a little bit with them. What about your record should they play up, perhaps? If there's any blemishes in your record, the bad semester that everyone has, what happened there? You know, how can you deal with it? So there are little things there. I'm really happy to talk to any undergraduate at AU in our department about these things. And I would also point you to other members of our committee right now. Laura Beers, Kate Hallman, Andrew Demchuk are the other members. And they're also, we've always talked about this, we're always willing to talk to people. So don't be shy. If you are going to apply for grad school, definitely do reach out. I'm happy to help. Zoe's question, it has me as a co-host here, so I'm just going to usurp that role from Professor Partovi here. So Zoe's question, thank you, Zoe, is can you talk more about careers that work with both law and history? So yes, I can. And I want to mention here, one of the reasons when you talk to law school admissions folks, why they really love getting history majors is two very specific reasons. Number one is that in law school, history is a huge tool that you need to understand, because you're understanding the progression of cases from point A to point Z. And along the way, you need to figure out what happened in the intervening years. History teaches you chronology, teaches you change over time, tools that will serve you well. The other one is the most important, and that is writing. So, you know, from all of us professors, we are persnickety, we are rude about writing sometimes. We come out and say, this isn't good enough, we need a stronger thesis, argument needs to be tighter, where's the evidence? All these things that you find annoying now, if you do end up in law school, or in grad school for that matter, you will think back to those moments and say, thank goodness I had that experience with my persnickety professors, because it will serve you incredibly well. The amount of people who are on law school journals, you know, your law reviews, whatnot, who were history majors or minors, it's like a gigantic, almost concentric Venn diagram. So just quickly want to mention that. In terms of the actual careers that Zoe's asked about, there's a large range. Obviously with a JD, opens you up to doing a lot of different work, from international development kind of work all the way over to political, since this is AU, I know that's close to people's hearts, political advocacy work, political organizing work, and everything in between. Things like consulting, things like international, trying to think what the accounting is the wrong word, but it's connected to accounting in terms of how the law regulates movement of finances. You think about things like the EU changing over Brexit, et cetera. You'll find that the legal profession is just all over all these different things. It's dynamic. And so, that is a sort of huge venue. Now, history, you've heard a lot from other folks today about that. In terms of what lies in between those two things, it's probably a smaller subsect, but there are some areas where I think you'll find some significant opportunities with both degrees. So I did mention the JD PhD route. If you look at the amount of court clerks in the federal court system for the last 20 years, you'll find the majority of them had JD and PhD, and a lot of them have PhDs in history. Now, that's a pretty small number of positions, so I won't dwell on that one. But the biggest one is policy work. There, you're going to find a significant amount of people with either MAs or PhDs in history, and or a JD or a JSD with PhD in law. And so those are folks who are working on the Hill in high up policy positions. Those are folks working in places like the Hudson Institute, Aspen Institute, that have this sort of unique skill set. So there are these things. I'm happy to talk, Zoe, if you have specific questions about any specific position or field, definitely drop me a line. Happy to discuss those with you.
Thank you. Well, we have a question from Dana here for our public history panelists. Are there skills you have developed in undergrad, other experiences outside of grad school that you feel have made you a good candidate for work in the public history field? Do you have advice for people with a BA and background in education, for example, who are interested in bridging their work with the public history field?
I would say that most of the experiences that I developed outside of both my undergrad and grad degree are the reason that I've been successful in the public history field. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but the reason that I work at the White House Historical Association is directly because there was a fellowship available through the AU's Public History Master's program that placed me there. And that's how I got started there, and that's how I got hired. So I think particularly if you're interested in public history, doing direct work in the field is immensely important. And that includes, doing internships and other opportunities. But I also would say to be careful in the public history field, particularly for women and people of color. A lot of the internships, experiences, et cetera, or things that will help you advance can be extremely exploitative. And so I always caution, don't work for free. Do not give away your labor for free. And I really stand by that. I know it can be really tough to find those opportunities, but you can make it work. And I would also say I personally could not afford to take an unpaid internship. Grad school is very expensive. You are adding, you're either taking out loans or, you're trying to fund it whatever way you can. But I would say think hard about the money and your time and effort in all of these things.
I'll second Lena there, just to kind of reiterate, really thinking through the financial decision of going to graduate school, because it will put you financially behind your peers. And that's something to consider. I mean, I went to grad school before I was 26, so I was still able to be on my parents' healthcare, but that's a major consideration as well if you're thinking about a grad degree, whether it's just a master's or a PhD. I mean, it's an incredible group of people. Like, you build a cohort like Lena. I went to her like a month ago with a question I had at work that she could help me out with because it's her specific area of research, and you build this incredible community of people. But there are also some cons, including the financial aspect. So I just would like to echo that before I say that for someone with a education background, I think you're super well suited as an applicant into a public history field, because I mean, right now, I mean, at least at Smithsonian, we are constantly looking to educators to be like, help us figure out how to take what we have and make it accessible to kids who are at home right now, who aren't going to school, or who are in Zoom school. And we need to make our collections more readily available and like things accessible and interesting to families kind of in need of material right now. And that's for the job market, but also just for applying to school, like you are really well suited to apply to a program because you can communicate with different audiences. That's a really big part of public history, is knowing audiences to write for, communicating with folks, especially if you're in like a public facing scenario. So I think definitely well suited with that education background.
Kai, would you like to add something?
I think Lena and Hannah covered it. They're both much more in the job market or in the actual employment field of public history than I am. So they know more than that I could speak on that.
Okay, great. Robert has a question for all of you. Let me see if I can pull it up here. There are too many people putting things in the chat. All right, how do you prepare to apply for grad school, whether it be a master's or PhD? Any advice or unexpected things you learned during your different graduate studies? Nicholas.
Sorry, go ahead. No.
Oh, you sure? Go ahead.
After you.
Okay. I would just say that when you're applying to grad school, really think through the program that you want. I also, like Lena, took a gap year in between my undergrad and graduate because I originally thought I was going to go straight from undergrad to grad school. And I was in my first semester of my senior year working on my statement of purpose and was applying to public history and also Masters of Library Sciences programs because I thought I might want to be an archivist, and I was applying to both, and I sat down to write my statement of purpose and I realized I couldn't tell those institutions why I wanted to be there because I didn't know. I just knew it was something I wanted to do, like the nugget was there, but I hadn't thought it through enough and I hadn't done the work enough to figure out what I wanted. So I think really giving yourself the time to be able to think through what program is best for you and how is it going to best prepare you for the life that you want and the career that you want. And so, I mean, I took a year and worked as a project archivist in a proper archive and realized that was not my journey. I love archivists. I work with them daily. They're incredible, but digitizing was not my journey. Public history was. And so really just giving yourself the time to think through that application process. So that way, when they ask you, why do you want to go here? You can say confidently, you know why, and you're the best applicant.
Go ahead, Nicholas.
So my graduate school experience was a little different from, I think, a lot of other people's. It was 7 or 8 years before I went back to graduate school after undergrad, and I got a public policy master's. And one of the things that I discovered in getting that degree was a lot of people who go to get masters right after undergraduate are getting that degree, particularly in public policy, to learn about how the world works. Because they haven't had a lot of practical experience. My experience with grad school was very different in that, and I didn't discover this until after I was in school, is I'd had a lot of practical experience. I had worked on policy for a long time. What I learned in grad school was to compare the academic experience with my own practical experience. So it was a different type of learning process. I was learning how does, how does what's being taught reflect to my own experiences, and how can I use that professionally as I move forward? And I think it really depends on what kind of learner you are. For me, I needed that practical grounding to really help me, to motivate me in grad school and to help me understand the materials that I was learning. But I think there are a lot of people in undergrad who could really benefit from the other experience as well. But I think that at least some of that professional experience really helps to give you some context for what you're learning.
I would say especially going directly from undergraduate to graduate school, I, for some reason, thought graduate school was just an extension of undergrad, but in fact, it is actually harder, and it's a different kind of learning, different kind of education. Your professors have higher expectations, and you're doing more real world work to an extent. which is not a bad thing at all, but it was something that for some reason shocked me. And I just realized this within the past month or so, being a semester and a half into fully undergrad or into fully an MA program, which is good because that's what I'm paying for. And that's why I'm doing the program, is to learn and be challenged, but it is different.
Faith, do you want to add something or?
Sure. Yeah, just briefly, kind of echoing off of what Professor Shelford, Professor Ralph already mentioned in terms of reaching out to folks for when you're applying for, especially for doctoral programs. I would also kind of emphasize reaching out to current graduate students as well. I think a lot of the generosity that Professor Shelford mentioned, that professors kind of expressed to those who are interested, also extends to graduate students. And they will give you a kind of unvarnished view of their experience as a graduate student in grad school at that institution shortly, close to the time that you want to join, because it's not always, it's almost never a pretty picture, I would say, some of the specifics of being a graduate student, but they have no motivation to sugarcoat it, I think is what I'm trying to say. So they will give you an honest view of what it's like to be there, what department culture is like, things like that, in a way that you may not get from faculty. Not because they're like trying to deceive you or anything, but it's just a different experience, being a faculty member in a department versus a graduate student. And I kind of similar, or maybe different for some of the experiences, I did my master's right after undergrad. But my motivation for doing so, I think, was I kind of knew exactly what I wanted to get out of a master's degree. Like I had my topic, I had a lay of the archives in London already. And so I kind of used that to kind of guide my experience. But normally I would echo the advice to maybe take some time off between doing undergraduate and a graduate degree if you feel that's best for you. In retrospect, I'm only in year 2 of this PhD, but in retrospect, I'm happy I kind of like went straight through, because I think it just made sense for my kind of path that I'm on. But it's not for everyone. Everyone's kind of in a different circumstance. So.
I would also add that, an MA can also be a way to sort of try out graduate school. See if it's for you or not, without taking the really big step of doing a doctorate. You don't want to go and do 4 years of a PhD and then decide that this is not for me. And so an MA can be a way in, a sort of entryway to see if this is something that you'd like to do or not. Any other comments that our esteemed panelists would like to make? Yes, go ahead, Nina.
I would also add that, I applied to PhD programs and I applied to AU's master's program in public history. I didn't get into any PhD programs, but I did get into the MA program at AU. And I think that should, if somebody doesn't want you, you might not get in, especially in the current market. If you're pursuing a graduate degree, a lot of people will be returning to graduate school at this point. If you don't get into a program, I would take it as a sign that it wasn't the one that was meant for you. The program that accepts you will probably, or if you have a choice, those will probably be better suited to you. So don't get discouraged if you don't get in on the first try. You should end up eventually where you're supposed to.
Well, thank you.
If I could add just,
yeah,
sorry, briefly to that, Lena. When I was applying, I had kind of and this is also, again, why it's good to reach out to faculty ahead of time, because one of the universities I wanted to apply to, the cycle before had accepted a ton of graduate students interested in history of the modern Middle East. And my would-be advisor told me very frankly, like, look, you can apply, but we're probably not going to accept people who focus on your subfield this cycle. Which is to say, it's very normal to reapply to programs. Don't feel like if you don't get in somewhere, you can, that they hate you irrevocably or something. It's obviously not the case. And there are all these sorts of factors that come into play. It's not like an objective analysis of your worth, right? It's all of these other things. So just wanted to add to that.
Thanks. Hannah has a question for Nicholas. Do you have any advice for people looking to enter the security and nonprofit fields, both for internships and careers?
Yeah, I have a lot of advice. So it's a hard field to get into, particularly in the NGO space. The organizations tend to be small. There isn't always a lot of turnover. The career paths can kind of be not clearly defined. And just to give you some sense of my background, like I said, I spent 2 years working not in the security field just so I could work in the security field. And then even when I got there, I worked for several organizations that really did a range of different nuclear policy, worked on nuclear policy from a range of different perspectives before I even got my chance to work at like the first big organization. So I think a couple things. One, always keep your eye open for like what opportunities might come up at different organizations. And there are a number of listservs that post internship and career opportunities. And just being aware of like what's out there is helpful. Two, informational interviews, making the relationship, establishing relationships with people who may not have positions today, but might, think of you down the line is really helpful. It's also helpful for you to understand the field. Three, something that didn't exist when I started, but I think is sort of a great a great benefit of the internet is anyone can write now. That you can publish things as much, on whatever topic you want. And most NGOs, not the big ones, but some of the smaller ones, are looking for content. And if you're looking for an opportunity, there are a lot of NGOs that are willing to give most people an opportunity to write about security issues. And it is unfortunate, but it's true. And I did this in grad school, that you will probably have to write for, you're not going to get paid to do it, but your name will get out there. And if the stuff is good, you will attract attention. And then the last piece, this is just something that I look for when I'm hiring, is show passion for, for the issues that the organization works on. And when I do interviews for either internships or job positions, what I really want to see is someone really understands what I work on. They don't have to be an expert, but they at least have a fundamental understanding, and that they genuinely are interested in the topic, and they're not sort of looking to leverage it to do something, else.
Thank you. Our chair has a word or two to say about PhD admissions, and then we'll get to Rachel's question.
Okay. So I don't mean to be the negative voice here or anything. I just want to throw a little bit of reality on the PhD idea. If one is pursuing a academic job, it's really wise to only apply to and go to a PhD if it's one of the top programs in your field and if you're fully funded. And just a word of what that means. The Princetons and Harvards and Stanfords and et cetera basically get 300 to 600 applicants, and they take about 15 people in. So you really have to be a superstar somehow to get into one of those places. That I, as a small town, northern Wisconsin hick, went to a University of Wisconsin Eau Claire and then Madison and got into these programs. The way I did it was to go to an MA program at Harvard first, and then proved myself there and outworked everyone basically. So, I mean, it's daunting. I mean, coming out of AU, we don't have a whole lot of people who've made it at that tier. And so one shouldn't make that your career goal. But that said, why not throw your hat in the ring and compete? But remember, if you're rejected, it's not a statement on you per se. It's just the numbers are stacked against you. Sorry for the dour note, but these are the times. And it's even worse during COVID because most schools are not taking any PhDs next year at the top tier.
It's a tough racket. Yeah, it's hard to talk about it in any other way. But if you're passionate about it and you're 100% committed to it, it's worth a shot at the very least, and see where it takes you. But yes, at some point, reality may come crashing down. Rachel has a quick question here. Ideally, should graduate school constitute a full-time job, or should you be supplementing your income with something else? And if so, what?
I think for at least I can speak for the public history program. It was not a full-time job. Or at least I didn't take it that way. I worked about 3 part-time jobs throughout grad schools, and it count 4 if it counts walking 2 kids to school daycare in the morning for just some like supplemental cash. Yeah, so it was, I don't want to gloss over it. It was like tough, and luckily I had like financial support from my family if things were pretty bad. But yeah, I worked about 3 jobs at the time because I didn't have a lot of funding. And so it can be tough to patch it all together sometimes, but it's definitely doable.
I would second Hannah on all of that. For at least for a master's program, unless you have money from your family or another way to supplement. I paid for my MA by myself, which meant that I really relied on the money I got from my fellowship with the White House Historical Association, and then also cobbling together some background positions. But I do think that for a master's program, especially one like public history, you want to be working while you're doing it. If you have the goal to go through with academia, it might be different. But if you want to be working in the field, then you want to be gaining experience in the field while you're getting your education.
Any other comments? Yes, go ahead, April.
Yeah, whoops.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'll be really fast. Yeah, I just want to add something. It is a very tough decision to decide to go for a PhD. And when students usually come to talk to me about this and want some advice about this, I almost always say take a break because it's a huge investment, and it's just different. There's just something, it's consuming in ways that I don't think we encounter that kind of thing in any other aspect. And it's a great way to spend one's life. I mean, I loved being in graduate school. I really did, but it's hard. It's hard. I would say too, remember, I usually say get into the best graduate program that you have if you're going for a PhD, and that you can be funded in. That's, you shouldn't be paying for a PhD. The last thing I would say is, I would like to reiterate Professor Lohr's. I ended up going to an Ivy League school after I got an MA in history someplace else, and had some kind of proof that I could do the job. And the last thing I would say is that even if you get a PhD and you don't get an academic job, your life doesn't end. My husband also has a PhD in history from Princeton University, and he's had a very interesting and very good career, okay, working in educational and cultural institutions. So it's a complicated decision to make, and there's a lot of stress in it, but I also want to say what Pedram said and what my own stepfather said when I was thinking about this is, you do what you love and you try to find a way to do it. So that may be a somewhat overly romantic view, but we've got one shot at life.
I would also add that most of the top schools these days, they don't accept anyone without funding. So
yeah, right.
If you get accepted, then you're getting a full ride plus a stipend. That was not the way it was when I first started going to grad school. It is the case now. Yeah. So if you get in, then at the very least, you know that you don't have to take on hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans to pursue this particular passion. Go ahead, Nicholas. I'm sorry.
So 2 things I want to mention on this point. My master's program was, I think 80 to 90% of it was paid for by the state of Maryland. So there are, state schools, University of Maryland, where you can get, if you work for the university while you're there, they do an enormous amount to subsidize your education and give you health care, and there's a really nice benefits package. But the other benefit to that was I got my next job through that research position at University of Maryland through one of the projects that I was working on. and I mean, so prior to my current job, which I just started in the last year, I spent the last 7 years as a researcher at Harvard, and like I got that through my master's program at Maryland. So it was it's nice how those connections can be made.
Thanks, Nicholas. Well, we are now at 9:05 p.m. John from the Career Center has also put a message into the chat for us. He's encouraging us to get in touch with him via LinkedIn. Please, all of you, make use of the Career Center. It's there as a resource for all of our students, and it's well worth your time. John, do you want to add anything?
Oh, just thanks so much for this opportunity. And I want to say that this community that exists is another reminder that there are so many resources among us that we can tap into. And so while I am a career advisor, I want you to think about the idea that everyone can be your career advisor as you move through this your careers. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, any other questions, comments from our panelists, from our audience? Wonderful. Well, I hope everyone got as much out of this as I did. This was wonderful. I thank you all for coming, and hopefully we can do this again in the future, maybe every term. We'll see. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.